Hi, everyone. Uh, Thanks so much for inviting me to have this guest lecture discussing the very interesting and relevant topic of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is being spearheaded by China as an economic, political, and strategic initiative spanning a host of nations, as well as various infrastructure and routes for trade. Before we get started into our in-depth discussion, I just want to emphasize that there are a host of links available under this video, which will give you useful background about the initiative and will also give you sort of get you up to speed with developments so far. I'm sure many of you would have heard of the Belt and Road Initiative in various forms. In some ways, how Australia is part of it, although we are physically quite far away from China. Quite interesting. A lot of it in the news. I'm sure a lot of it more to come as well, given the geopolitical developments that are occurring as part of the COVID-19 crisis. Look at it from which countries are really integrally involved and which countries have chosen to stay out of it, as well as the benefits and costs that may be associated with such a mammoth initiative. So with that, let's get started. So the Belt and Road Initiative is sort of China's way of reviving the Silk Route, which was an ancient trade route and is presently in different forms being touted to be the new Belt and Road Initiative. Here is a quick background about what the Belt and Road Initiative entails.
In February 2016, the first Silk Road train arrived in Iran, after making a nearly 6,000-mile trip, taking just 2 weeks. This route is the start of what many are calling the New Silk Road, modeled after ancient trade roads which allowed the East and West to connect in the BC era. The new pathway is expected to revolutionize China, as well as other countries along the way. So, what exactly is the New Silk Road? Well, to get a sense of where we are today, let's look at the original Silk Road. For a long period of time, there were localized kingdoms and empires spanning the globe. But the region between China and Western Asia and Europe is not very hospitable, and crossing it back in 200 BC would have been incredibly dangerous. As a result, while trade did occur, it was much more regional, and long-distance trade routes were rare. But when the West encountered Chinese silk, demand for it outweighed the danger. The huge demand led to an entire network of trade routes crisscrossing Central Asia. Although many other goods found their way along this road, it was named after its most lucrative good, silk. Most importantly for human civilization, the increased trade led to culture sharing between the East and the West. Religions, philosophies, and even diseases made their way from one region of the world to the other. And while the original Silk Road was a political and economic explosion, the new Silk Road promises to change the face of Asia. It's being hailed as the signature foreign policy initiative of Chinese President Xi Jinping, and could be the largest economic undertaking since the Marshall Plan post-World War II. In fact, many are saying that the road would be China's answer to the US's Trans-Pacific Partnership, which presently excludes China and Russia and seeks to streamline global trade. First and foremost, the new trade routes will make it easier for China to trade with former Soviet states, which have seen a sharp rise in trade since the USSR's collapse. The plan to build more roads, railways, ports, and other transit infrastructure is being called the One Belt, One Road Plan. This is comprised of two routes: a land road running from East Asia into Western Europe, and a maritime route stretching to Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Africa by sea. Along the way, these routes will pass through as many as 60 countries and regions, covering half of the world's entire GDP. Just the China-Pakistan corridor alone is expected to cost $46 billion. And while the total cost for the project is unknown, analysts expect the road to bring in an additional $2.5 trillion of trade to China in the next decade. This long reach across Asia will serve to boost economic prosperity, but perhaps more importantly, give China greater control over its neighbors. Some strategists in Beijing have also suggested that an increase in economic stability may undermine the appeal of radical Islam in the region, particularly in countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan, as well as violent autonomous states like Xinjiang. With trade agreements like the TPP threatening China's influence in the global economy, the new Silk Road is likely China's best bet at keeping trade supremacy, as well as exerting further control over Asia. In any case, China is about to own a huge number of infrastructure infrastructure projects in a diversity of regional countries. That alone puts them in a risky yet incredibly strong bargaining position with the rest of the world.
All right, so that's a little bit of an overview of what the Belt and Road Initiative entails and may look like in its full form. So yes, it is meant or planned to connect parts of Central Asia, Africa, Middle East, and Europe. Many of these countries, which would be part of, say, about 60 countries, which were initially supposed to be part of this project, and many more today, have been landlocked for decades, which has affected their ability to participate in global trade, as well as open up their markets to international investment, infrastructure development. And that's part of the reasons why the Belt and Road Initiative is being considered as one of the largest infrastructure projects, which is going to span multiple continents and thus reposition China's leadership, as well as the opening up of many landlocked smaller countries in international trade. And thus, it's an extremely important initiative for us to all be aware of as students of global business. So yes, it is expected to have 6 major routes, which would consider or include several rail lines, roads, ports, other basic infrastructure, investment mechanisms as well. And these economic corridors are expected to not only boost global trade, but facilitate travel between countries, also facilitate the exchange of knowledge, infrastructure, investment, and thus the overall economic growth and development of the nations which are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, yes, this is an initiative which is being spearheaded by China, and thus it does mean that it will give access to China also to new markets as a means of exploring exports for its domestic producers, but also being able to transfer technology, even construction, mining. These industries would definitely see a big boost from the Belt and Road Initiative. So formally, the BRI emphasizes 5 key areas of cooperation as part of their overarching principles, which is to coordinate development policies between nations which are part of it, forging infrastructure and facilitating networks, strengthening investment and trade relations between countries, enhancing financial cooperation, and deepening social and cultural exchanges. We will be looking at some of these in more detail in the later parts of our discussion today. So let's now look at the key financial and regulatory initiatives and institutions which have been formed to facilitate this project, as well as what it looks like from benefits and costs to various actors who are involved directly into the project. So there have been a host of bilateral agreements between China and other partner countries in order to facilitate these investments. It has been questioned globally as well from a critical point of view of the kind of transparency and fairness that all nations which are part of this agreement are sort of experiencing. And that's something that's been one of the major criticisms of the Belt and Road initiatives from across major world economies. There is at this stage no institutional framework or decision-making mechanism through which participating countries are connected with one another. So most of their relationships are sort of independent on a one-on-one basis with China directly. And thus there is at this stage no global network or platform which is overseeing the implementation of this project. So Chinese-owned state banks are leading the investment. For example, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the New Development Bank, of which various nations are part of. The Bank of China, in fact, is looking at this as a great opportunity to make the Chinese yuan as the main trading and investment currency across this region and where the investments are flowing through as well. So that's another thing that is sort of questioning the status quo of the US dollar as the key currency of international trade. And lastly, the expansion of Chinese banks into these new Belt and Road markets is another sort of avenue for international trade that is being explored. Overall, like I've mentioned previously, major criticisms lie in the level of accountability that China has, especially because of the lack of an overarching sort of institution, an independent institution, which is overseeing all the transactions, investments, and implementation, as well as the lack of transparency that is being implemented between the bilateral agreements with countries. And this is something that has sort of made the whole project sort experience a lot of international backlash and criticism from various countries involved. So these are some of the examples where these sort of drawbacks are coming to light. So for example, in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, there have been numerous reports that because of the inability of the countries to be able to pay back the financial debt, which they were able to seek as part of Belt and Road Initiative, they are having to now give way to important ports to Chinese leadership as a form of payment. And that's sort of causing questions around strategic national sovereignty, as well as the fairness of the whole investment. I would encourage you guys to explore these topics and news further. There's a lot more that has happened as well since I put together these. So this is another example of what different points of view look at from the Belt and Road Initiative, and where the sort of bottlenecks and challenges have already started emerging. Now, it's important as critical thinkers to be able to question as to whether or not this is going to be positive, a net positive for international trade. And thus, let's sort of explore the benefits and costs to China, which is the leader of this initiative, as well as the rest of the world. So in terms of economic benefits, definitely a lot more exploration and opening up of markets which were earlier not as involved in international trade is a great avenue. It is also an opportunity to stimulate domestic industry from manufacturing industry perspective. So there has been overcapacity, for example, in steel, minerals for Chinese producers, and thus opening up of these trade markets will help them to sort of stimulate exports as well. It does also help mitigate rising domestic labor and manufacturing costs. So over the last couple of decades, the cost of labor is becoming more and more expensive given the level of development that the Chinese economy has been witnessing. And thus it's sort of an avenue to access sort of less expensive labor from Belt and Road Initiative partner countries. Whether the yuan will end up being a global currency for international trade is something that one needs to consider as well, as that is being touted as one of the key forms of expanding China's presence in the region. And then, of course, is the whole question around financing. So at this stage, various international sort of conglomerate banks have been involved, but most of it is being led by Chinese-led state banks. And it's expected to look at an investment of $1 trillion or more to be able to finance these projects in their full form. Where the money is coming from, what kind of accountability is being laid on China, the lender, as well as the countries which are receiving this investment, the payment terms, that again is sort of not very clear at this stage. In terms of political benefits and costs, yes, it does increase Asian influence in the West, specifically led by China, but also smaller countries which are officially part of the Belt and Road Initiative. It does help China influence higher control in smaller partner countries. Some of those negatives are being seen from debt lock-ins and examples that I discussed earlier of Sri Lanka, Pakistan. Chinese military presence across the Belt and Road Initiative countries again is giving China a stronger hold on, say, key ports, key land routes and infrastructure as well. And thus the question remains as to will China create an economic empire in Asia and Africa. Now that's all about China. Let's see how this project benefits the world and what the associated costs may be. So as I mentioned, countries in Central Asia which weren't as involved in international trade have got this opportunity to seek investment and thus get connected to international markets. There's also a lot of African nations as well as the Middle East and Europe, which are part of this project. It is expected for sure to facilitate international trade just because of the aforementioned reasons. Infrastructure development, strong supply chain, and logistics networks, which will be a result of the physical land as well as maritime sea route connectivity between these nations, is another important benefit to global trade. And then, of course, to some extent, although Australia is not so physically close to the entire project, Australia does have some strategic interests. And I would encourage you guys to have a read about how Australia and what Australia's position is on the Belt and Road Initiative as well. In terms of costs, who really loses out? We've looked at some of the risks and the lack of transparency that the project entails. It also is sort of unfolding certain hidden costs of investment. So some of the smaller countries who are unable to pay back the debt, having to lose their key strategic and national access points, which is questioning the whole integrity of the project. In certain nations, this has been considered as a threat to national security and their autonomy. And a big case in point is India. So India and China are, yes, landlocked neighbors, but also have a lot of strategic and national differences as well as similarities. And common sense would say that India would be part of such an initiative. But you would be surprised to know that India has decided to not formally be part of the Belt and Road Initiative because it has argued that participation and the opening up of land routes as well as maritime routes for this initiative would actually be a strategic threat to their national security. And thus, despite the financial and economic benefits that this project would entail, India has in fact decided to stay away from the Belt and Road Initiative. And if you go back to the whole map which charts out the Belt and Road Initiative, you would see that the maritime routes in fact go around India's borders, but do not go across. There's also land routes which go around from the northern part of India, which again has already raised plenty of concerns, especially because one of the first corridors which started operating as part of the Belt and Road Initiative was that of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And that sort of did cause concerns around the India-Pakistan borders and the opening of land routes. And that's in fact received a lot of flack from the Indian government as well. And of course, environmental concerns around what this initiative will mean in terms of the use of fossil fuels, higher mining perhaps. Will China use this as an opportunity to in fact export its renewable energy prowess, which it has gathered significantly in the last couple of decades? Or would this be largely fossil fuel led development? And then of course the emissions and related to air, noise, water pollution that this higher global trade will entail. Lastly, I want to explore a little more about India's decision to stay out of the Belt and Road Initiative and whether it would end up being a net positive for the country. It's important to look at this from various standpoints. One, of course, is the economic benefits that would entail. But like we have all discussed in the past, there's also political, economic, cultural, environmental benefits that countries need to consider before participating in any form of partnership with another country or another project. And those are some of the reasons, in addition to national security and strategic reasons, that support India's decision to stay out. And so some of the comments that have been stated in the media from India's point of view discuss how no country can accept a project that ignores its core concerns of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Some of those link back to the China-Pakistan economic corridor that I discussed previously. The national priorities for sovereignty trump commitment to everything else, and everything else in this particular case would directly refer to economic growth and development and the boosting of India's international trade as part of this initiative. So distrust with China and India's otherwise political ongoing issues with Pakistan are significant impediments to India's involvement in this project at this stage. There is a little bit of ego play as well, especially because India was not invited by China in the initial stages to be part of this project, and because China did want to take overall leadership. So the China-Pakistan economic corridor, a big challenge to the project and India's involvement. And examples are plenty. So China's control of Pakistan's Gwadwar port, again, boosts Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean, and which basically encircles India's borders and challenges its security and autonomy. And fight for Asian influence between the two fastest growing economies, again, is one of the key impediments to India's involvement. And it can definitely be argued that India has isolated itself by not participating in the project, which basically encircles the country. From the point of view of strategic investment, trade, and investment in China. So it's not like the two countries are not participating in international trade. They definitely are, and they do have independent bilateral projects and investment in both countries, sort of cross investment, etc. It's just formal participation in the Belt and Road Initiative that India is sort of strategically against. India is also partnering with other nations. So there are trade partnerships with other countries in Europe, across Asia, India and the EU, India, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Russia, and even Australia and Japan are looking at sort of parallel trade agreements to counter the effects of not participating in the Belt and Road Initiative. And we'll see how these play out for the Indian economy. So thus, overall, I hope I have been able to give you various standpoints to look at it, for this really important and mega infrastructure project. And the years to come will be really, really critical to understand how this project plays out for world trade. But it's definitely something that we can't miss from the point of view of discussing geopolitical and regional economic integration when it comes to international business. And I look forward to any questions or comments that you may have about this short lecture. I do usually have a lot more time to delve into various aspects of this project, but given our shift to remote learning, it's sort of restricted the time that I'm able to spend on it. But I do hope that it provided you some insights and that you would explore the additional reading material further to be able to get a more sort of in-depth understanding of the project and various standpoints to it as well. Good luck, and thanks so much for having me.